Welcome to another program in our series, Free Thinking Forum. I'm Bill Weir, the producer and host, and I'm delighted today to have with me Catherine Campion.
Thank you for having me.
And Catherine, you have an occupation that is different than some people have even heard of.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to ask you first, how did you first become interested in death and death midwifery?
Well, I think I've always been interested in reducing suffering. All the choices that I make in my life, I try to think about how will that affect sentient beings, humans and other living creatures. And probably spent what's probably the first half of my life being an actress and having fun and focusing on like learning and just traveling the world. And over the past 5-6 years, I realized I wanted to figure out a way to be more of service to people. And for me, that's turned out to be, I teach senior and adaptive yoga, and I started realizing that the dying community, seniors and young people that are dying, are sort of an underserved aspect of the population. And it was brought to my attention that I'm very comfortable around death, and we live in a very death-phobic culture that is not interested in contemplating our mortality. We're very materialistic, which is sort of the opposite of embracing the temporal nature of the human life, that it will come to an end, and we really like to push that away. And I think a lot of suffering comes from that. So about 5-6 years ago, as I was moving my life down to Ecuador, that's a whole other story, I happened to meet a woman, Olivia Barham, in Los Angeles, who runs a little school called Sacred Crossings, and they teach death midwifery. So I am a death midwife, and I serve people at end of life and those around them.
Good. That's important.
I think so.
Because it's been apparent to me they're underserved as well.
Mm.
I've conducted funerals. I've also ministered to people before and after. Mm-hmm. It's something that, well, you have that unique skill, not unique, I guess, but a unique way of approaching it. Mm. And so, have you defined death midwifery?
For myself, so there are a lot of different people practicing this now. It is, I would say, a new ancient art or a new ancient career, because historically, and in some cultures around the world, this is still the case, until probably about the time of the Civil War, families took care of their dying and their dead. Now a lot of people in the Western world are sent away somewhere to die, and then when they die, the body is sent away somewhere to be taken care of. And historically, for tens of thousands of years, humans have cleaned and prepared their own dead and had their own home funerals, whether they choose to display the body or not, depending on different cultures. And most cultures traditionally have either a funeral pyre or just burying the body in the earth to decompose naturally. During the Civil War, people wanted their loved ones transported back home when they were killed in the war, and that's when they were figuring out embalming, or as I like to call it, pickling the body, because I think it's very inappropriate from an environmental standpoint, and it's very expensive, and it's not something we should do, and it's certainly not something we need to do. So bodies had to be transported across what is a pretty large country pre-air conditioning, and the bodies would begin to rot. And so this was a way that was discovered, like, oh, we can pickle bodies the same way we pickle specimens in jars in laboratories. And somebody started realizing this was a whole industry, that we could start taking the funeral away from the family and bringing it into funeral homes. I don't mean to disrespect funeral homes, but a lot of what they do, I think, is unnecessary and perhaps inappropriate and extremely expensive, and it needn't be.
That's important. And so how much, do you have an idea of how much it costs to
do like a traditional Western American burial through like a funeral home?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear, I mean, it can be $10,000, $15,000. I think you could even spend that just on the casket and add in all the services of pickling the body. And they have to do, if you go to I just went to a friend's funeral yesterday, actually. A friend of mine passed from cancer, and we kind of served each other at the end of, I was sort of being a death midwife to her, and she was teaching me how to be a better death midwife. And that is a beautiful cemetery, and the only way it can have those smooth rolling green lawns is by doing concrete liner beds underneath the caskets, because if you put the caskets in without a concrete liner, the earth will shift and they will sink, and you can't mow, you know, thousands of graves if they're not lined that way. So that's why they do that, but I don't quite understand why we don't just put the body in the earth, maybe plant a tree over it and let it decompose naturally, whether it's wrapped in a shroud or in a wicker basket or a natural pine. She was buried in a natural pine casket, but of course, unfortunately, she wanted to be buried near her sister, and so they were in Lakewood, and they are working on doing green burial there, but that is another aspect. I haven't quite defined death midwifery yet, I just realized, because there are many aspects to it. So funerals are one thing, and that's not actually my focus, but I find that is a big focus of a lot of death midwives, is bringing these funerals back home and back to the family and helping people do that. There are other aspects. Green burial is a big one for me, and I hope to one day own my own green cemetery, maybe when I'm moving more towards retirement, and can offer that just natural burial where people can decompose in the earth, which you should be able to do for like $1,000 or $1,500 to like buy a little parcel of land. Or there are a lot of places outside of the city where you can just be buried on your own land. You know, your whole family could just be buried on your plot of land the same way, again, people did for thousands of years. Another aspect of death that I'm interested in serving, well, hospice. I studied hospice under Twilight Brigade in California, which is a nonprofit that serves veterans that are dying alone. A lot of veterans don't have friends and family to be with them when they're dying. It can be a very lonely position, and we just sit with people in whatever way they want, whether they want to chat or play games or just have someone sit in silence in their final days. So that's another way that I like to serve. And if you're aware of compassion and choices?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not involved with them yet, but I'm learning more about them, and that is working on legislation and ideally making it legal for people to finish their life when they're ready to. A lot of people are suffering immensely, whether it's physically or emotionally, and there is a religious history behind the legislation of our bodies, in this instance, of when you can choose to end your life. So we're working towards making it legal. I think there's 7 or 8 or maybe more states that have finally legalized it, but it's, again, so bizarre that we're telling people that they can't take their own lives. Again, it really goes back to religious beliefs of why people are so hung up on that. But I would like to help people legally find ways that they can finish up when they feel like life isn't worth living anymore, if it's so physically or emotionally painful for them.
Yes. That is really important work that you're doing.
Yeah.
To help.
I don't like to suffer, so I don't, maybe some people do, they're gluttons for punishment, but I really just want to find ways that I can reduce suffering for people, and that's one of them.
Good for you. Now, but I've heard something about death doula?
Oh yeah, death doula versus death midwife.
Yeah.
So in the birth world, those are two very different professions. A birth midwife is a medically trained professional to do labor at home or not outside of a hospital situation, and the doula is the support. When I got introduced to this profession, it was in California, and in California I find we use the term death midwife. And then I moved back to Minnesota last year, and I found people were like, oh, is that like a death doula? And I was like, oh, I hadn't heard of death doula. So it's just regional, I think, and there is no differentiation because there isn't yet like a national certification. There are individual schools that teach and give you a certificate, but there's no licensing or medical training required. It's more like a bridge between the medical world and hospice and these funeral parlors or funeral centers. I like to think I serve as an advocate for the families to kind of get some answers and help them know what their options are, because I think if you ask most people, they'll think, well, if someone dies, you have to call a funeral director, and that is not true for most states in the US. It is not true for Minnesota. You can handle all the paperwork yourself. You can have a home funeral. That was a lot of my training, was you know, keeping the body cold enough that you could keep them at home for a few days for a home viewing. I realized, I grew up in a Catholic family, and I think that's a part of Catholic upbringing. I'm not interested in home viewing. When I've talked to my friends and family, no one I personally know says they want their corpse on display for a visitation. But my training, all the women I trained with and my teacher is very keen on that being a closure where you can see the dead body to kind of really, you know, come to terms. Because when else do we see dead bodies? We pretty much never do. So I can see the benefits of it, but I personally, that's not a way that I'm interested in serving, and no one in my family has any interest in displaying the body. We sort of just like, you're dead, wrap you up in a cloth, drop you in the earth, let you decompose, ashes to ashes, and all that jazz.
Yes. Well, I like your approach. That explains something important too. How about a hospice worker? Are you like a hospice
Well, that is
worker?
one area. So there are hospice nurses. So I think when people think of hospice, there's two parts of hospice. One is going into hospice as a period of your life. And I think that's generally considered when they think you're going to die within the next 3 months. I think in the medical world they say 3 months, but I've also heard 6 months. So there's the time frame is hospice, and then there's also a location of a hospice. And there are medical professionals, hospice nurses, and palliative care nurses. So palliative care works to reduce physical suffering, usually with medication. I think that's a great profession, and I love that that exists. And if I were in physical pain but still wanted to be alive, I would like to think I could get some medicine. I personally don't have a medical background, so I'm more interested in easing the emotional suffering of it. So I do consider myself a hospice worker because I volunteer in hospice, and I got my training through Twilight Brigade, but a hospice nurse is like a very specific training and licensing and certification.
Good. Yeah, so oftentimes a hospice nurse is involved in the situations you're working on?
They could be. I've mostly been working, well, so right after I finished my training, I did Sacred Crossings, Death Midwifery. I did hospice training through Twilight Brigade, and I also got certified as an in-home health aide through Los Angeles County. And right after I finished my 3 trainings, a few months later, my best friend at 37 years of age was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she died just over a year ago. You'll also notice I try to use the word died and not passed or was lost, or, you know, there's all these euphemisms we use because we're death phobic. So I try to always use the word dead and death and dying because that's really what's happening and we needn't be afraid of it. So yeah, she died a year ago. I inherited this among many other dresses that her mother was kind enough to send to me. So when I do talk about or do things involved in the death world or go to a funeral, I try to wear one of her dresses. But with her and with Colleen, my friend who just died last week, it was more like as an emotional support, and especially with Mimi, my best friend, I kept asking her, like, well, would you like to do like a legacy work? Would you like to leave stuff for your daughter? She had a 9-year-old daughter when she finally died. And would you like to plan your funeral? And most people I find don't really have any interest in that. So again, a lot of my training was about like helping people plan their funerals, and I find most people are sort of like, nah, I don't really care, I'll be dead. And they're just like, or they go get a bunch of, have an open bar and just have a party and tell stories about me. And, you know, like a wake, you know, my family's from Ireland and I love the idea of an Irish wake, a celebration. Colleen's funeral yesterday was full of people in dresses like this, a lot of hippies and a lot of color. And most of the funerals I go to are not somber affairs dressed in black. It's really exciting for me to go to a funeral and not feel like the oddball who's wearing a floral, brightly colored dress. That I do see a lot of people that are more realizing the stuff that comes after death is more about the living, because the dead are dead, and so it's not to honor them as much as it is for ourselves to kind of get through it and celebrate that person's life.
Rather than mourning.
Well, both. You can do both, but mourning, it should be seen as a natural part of life. And I think recently, or, you know, for the past century anyway, as we've pushed death out of our lives and into you know, dark rooms or fluorescent illuminated rooms in hospitals. We have, we think mourning, the same way we think illness is this horrible thing to push away or fix. And it's like, well, a lot of illness, there's no fixing for it. So let's start with where we are. So mourning is very natural. And we, of course, have to mourn our loved ones. Yes. But it, and at that funeral I was at yesterday, there was as much crying as there was laughter, but they should be woven together. And I think recently, and I mean like in the past 150 years in the United States, if you laughed at a funeral, that would be, you know, especially, taboo. Yeah, and with the Judeo-Christian woven through the fabric of the United States culture. And I'd like to get a little, now that we're getting so many more Muslims in the country, I'd like to kind of understand their culture as well, because you know, all religions, I guess, are sort of equally bizarre to me, but I like to understand them to see, like, where did this idea, you know, Judaism has a lot of interesting culture and ceremony and tradition around death, you know, sitting Shiva and mourning, don't do anything for yourself and cover the mirrors and wear complete black and be somber for days. So it's all very interesting to me, but I like to bring this more like celebration kind of death party to the game.
So do I.
Yeah, good, good.
We celebrate a life even before they die.
Yeah. I like that idea of throwing funeral parties before people die. Some people do get to be lucky enough, like Colleen knew she was dying. She had terminal cancer for years. My best friend pretty much knew she was dying, but by the time she had really come to terms with it, she was too sick to have a party. But if you know you're going to be dying soon and you're well enough to have a party, why don't we do more funerals for the living? You know, wouldn't that be fun to really get to say goodbye? There'd be a lot less grief and suffering after the fact if we could get things off our chest, you know, say things to the person. You know, because one thing that I learned from my best friend's death last year, I immediately, as soon as she died, my first feeling was relief, because she had been suffering for 3 years with cancer. So that was my first feeling, and it was immediately followed by regret. Even all the things I did to prepare for her death, I immediately regretted. I could have done more, I could have said more, I could have been a better friend to her. And I don't know that I could have been a better friend to her, but that was my initial reaction, and I thought, there's a reduction in suffering I want to do for the living, those left behind as well, because so many of us regret and suffer because of that, because of things we didn't do in advance. And when someone knows they're terminal, what a great opportunity. Whether it's to tell them, like, you know what, you did this thing to me when I was a kid and I've never gotten, you know, get things off your chest, or tell them, like, I've never really conveyed to you how much you've inspired me and changed my life, so why not do these, you know, while people are still living and can hear it.
Yes.
For everybody's sake.
Yes, let's get in the habit of saying more than thank you. Telling how you inspired my life.
Yeah, because people don't know. If you don't tell them, how do they know? You know, how much you've affected people's lives.
So, could you give an example, more detail about the process? Are you beginning before they're on the verge of death?
Mm-hmm. Well, like I say, there's all these different ways that a death midwife can serve, whether it's being with someone in hospice who's terminal. Some people are grief counselors. People, whether someone needs a grief counselor because they're dying and they're having difficulty facing that, or grief counselors for people who've lost loved ones to death recently. There's home funeral planning, there's green burial, there's all these different aspects, and I'm new enough in my career that I'm really just reaching out and saying, how can I serve you? And that's really been helpful to me, that I've had people say, I just want a person who doesn't really know me that I can just unburden. I just want to talk to you about how scared I am to die, or I want to talk to you about the fact that I don't think there's anything after this, and my family's religious and I can't, they'll disown me if I talk to them about the fact that I don't believe I'm going to heaven or the alternative. So that is something that I really want to offer, is to serve those populations. There are already so many churches that serve people in hospice or for funerals at the end of life, and there's a lot of death midwives who are more new age or spiritual, and they bring their ideas to the table. And I found there is a growing, you know, especially in the Western world, there's a growing percentage of atheists, humanists, Unitarians, non-believers, agnostics, people that don't want any of that. Like my whole family, basically, even though we come from Catholic culture, we all kind of feel like, I don't want prayers or spiritual stuff, or, you know, oh, she's probably in a better place. You know, all these like sayings that don't ring true to us. So I want to serve that population that wants none of that, because I don't really have any beliefs. I plead ignorance to it all. I'm baffled by how people can be so secure in their faith or notions about what comes next or what came before. And I like to be a clean slate, and because of that, I feel like I could serve any population without bringing my beliefs to the table, because I don't really have any.
And just before we came on the set, you were showing a picture of religions of the world.
Yeah,
and
we could.
Just an amazing.
We could show that.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, so this is the evolutionary tree of religion, and I refer to this whenever people are so secure in their particular sect. I just say, look at this and find yourself if you can, because there's only just a little segment. You know, most people we know probably in the United States, if they're religious, tend to be Christian. You can barely even find Christianity on this chart. And then if you do, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of subdivisions of Christianity. So to me, it's just a visual representation of the guessing. I just call religion and faith and spirituality and all that, just it's different guesses. And if you want to go, I pick this one because it feels good to me, great. There's a lot of good to be found. Religion, I think, has done some good in the world, but it just kind of, to me, shows the ridiculousness of, like, there are thousands of different paths to choose, and why would you think yours is the one?
Where did we find that? Is it online?
I just Googled it by finding, because I came upon it years ago. I just Googled like evolutionary tree of religion, and I like how it merges faith, myths, and mysticism, because I do lump all religions into that faith, myths, and mysticism. They're stories, and they can serve a great purpose, morality tales, but to attach to one and say that this is the one true way is very egotistical in my mind.
I agree.
Yeah.
And as you know, I'm a retired Unitarian Universalist minister and a humanist, meaning that we focus on the values by which we want to live our life, not on what comes after and not where we came from. And it's very helpful, I think, for you to be known to many people of my point of view, to realize that they might want to engage you to help with the process.
Yeah, I can't wait to find out all the different ways I can be of service, because I think when I started this journey 5-6 years ago, I thought, oh, I'm going to focus on home funerals and planning funerals with people. And the more that I spent time in that, well, I realized there's already so many people. I say it's women. It's almost, I'm going to say 98, 99% women in this end-of-life world. The funeral industry in the U.S. is mostly men. I don't know what percent. I think I've heard like 80% men at least own and operate funeral parlors, funeral homes. And then this death midwifery, I mean, it has the word wife in it, so it's kind of unfortunate that it focuses on women, but it is almost entirely women, and almost entirely senior women. I don't encounter women under 60 very often in this world. And I think because if you're over 60, you've probably lost someone close to you, whether it was a spouse. I meet a lot of women who have lost their children, and it gives them a connection. I can't imagine anything worse in the world than to lose your child, especially like a teenager or young adult where you got to really get to know it and never got to see, you know, see all the, its life become this full-fledged adult, you know. And I have lost a lot of younger friends. And Mimi, her mother, did not have another child. So to lose your only beautiful baby girl at 37 years of age, just heartbreaking to me. And now I lost my train of thought. What were you talking about?
First, let me tell you, we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
So let's, what do you think the audience wants to know?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, people are welcome to contact me if they have questions, or just Google about it. But I think...
I think we've seen on there it is.
That's just my email address if you want to shoot me any questions. But just know that so much is in your hands. Do some research about what you can do, and think about how you might want to live a good death in addition to a good life, and how do you want to die. and know that so much of it is in your power. And if you don't want to die in a hospital, decide that now. I really encourage anyone over the age of 18, don't wait till you're 60, 70 and you think you might die soon, because anyone can get sick or die at any point. But healthcare directive. That's another big part of my death midwifery, is I get groups of people together to do a healthcare directive party. Get your friends together. If you don't know what that is, just look it up. You can find them for free online. You can download them. It must be for your state. So if you're in Minnesota or whatever state, make sure that you get your death care directive. Healthcare directive, death care directive is different. And have witnesses sign it, and you can say what you want at the end of your life, so you can die the way that you want to.
That's important.
Yeah.
And in the congregation that I take part in, we've had, the ministers have offered training in helping people fill out that form and keep it on file, and even more detailed suggestions of what they want.
Yeah. Choose someone to be your representative. That's the most important thing, is tell someone what you want, have them be on paper your healthcare representative, and then go over it together, so that if you can't communicate, you want someone to know, like, there are all sorts of measures they can take to prolong your life. But if you're already sick and you're like, I don't want intubation, I don't want a tube stuck down my throat that's going to be there the rest of my life to feed me, I'm ready to go. You got to put it in paper, because other people are going to fight to keep you alive, even if it's not what you want.
Even if the hospital has that responsibility.
Yeah.
And you have to make it clear that
what
if you don't want intubation, you don't want extraordinary measures to keep you alive.
Yeah. And you don't need to spend $15,000 on a funeral, so you can get it done for a couple $1,000s. You can do it yourself.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what else? You mentioned several organizations. Would it be well that they look up those websites?
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned on those compassionate choices.
What's the website? What's the address?
I'm going to say compassionandchoices.org.
Yes.
But you can, again, it's always easiest just to Google compassion and choices. Yeah.
I'm associated with it.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
But you mentioned a few others. Would they be appropriate for people to follow up with, or?
Sure. Which?
Well.
Oh, Twilight Brigade. If you're a veteran or you know a veteran who is in hospice or going to be in hospice, Twilight Brigade is a resource to get someone to help a veteran with hospice.
Good.
Sacred Crossings was my training in Los Angeles, but there are a lot of midwife training. If you're interested in training to becoming a midwife, there are schools all over the United States, and you can find one locally to you.
Good.
Yep.
I've already looked up Sacred Crossings.
Oh, yeah.
That's a great name.
It really is, and yeah, each school has a different focus, and her focus is a lot on, I mean, she does it all, but she really focuses on like the home burial and the ceremony and cleaning and preparing the body and doing these beautiful funerals for people and helping people do their funerals in their own homes.
Wow. I'm so happy that you were able to come here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. We just met a few days ago. It's
That's right.
Yeah.
At the First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis.
Yeah, at a death talk, yep. Because I go to I'm a deathling. I go to all the death positivity stuff.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, very nice.
And thank you for tuning in.
Yeah.